going to be demonstrating some watercolor techniques. Should be good for beginners using this photograph. In particular, I like the mood of this photograph, so if possible, I'm going to keep that in mind during the execution of it. Starting out, wetting the paper with a small spray bottle and using a mop brush that holds generally lots of water to just spread it out. And then after that we'll let it dry somewhat, especially we let the sheen go off the paper so there's no standing water. Once the paper is moderately dry, in this case it doesn't have to be totally super bone dry, I'm going to lay down some simple, very light washes that are going to delineate the structure of the painting, the main structure, foreground, midground and background. So I have a blue, an ultramarine blue, right at the top of the painting. That's going to be the far background. Then a yellow ochre coming down from the sky into the land, and then more browny tones and maybe with a touch of violet coming into the foreground. And I'm trying to lay something a little different down, showing features of interest like the path. Since I'm not using a pencil to do an underdrawing, I'm just giving myself a clue there where things are going to go. So the path is a little different than the other colors there. I've left a white patch there for the what's going to be a reflective pool. And now we're almost finished this underpainting. I'm going to finish it off with a more intense browny color, a reddish browny color for the near ground, the foreground. And now we let that dry. Use a hairdryer if you want to speed it up. And once it's dry, we can begin our next major step, which is putting in some detail into the background. Because this is background, we are paying attention to making it not too detailed, but maybe more of an impressionistic feel to it, and certainly lighter in tone. Still light in tone. I'm using a small calligraphy fine brush there just to use the edge of the brush, and I'm holding the brush towards the back end, and that makes me use my arm more than my fingers, which is good for this type of technique. Gives a loose feel to it. It's a style of Edward Wesson and Ciago, British watercolorists, who did more impressionistic overall styles. There I've used a bit too heavy color, so the violet is a bit too much, and so I'm blending it with a little bit of water on the brush now to knock it back a bit. But at the same time, I had an idea when I was doing that I'd be bringing some trees more into the midground from the background, and that's what I'm continuing to do now, bringing in some trees in front of the background now to the midground. just continuing to flesh out the background and a bit of the midground. And sometimes it looks a little bit too hard-edged for background, and spraying with water judiciously can tend to harmonize the whole thing, or I should say to unify it, which is a good thing on the background. Now we move on to the midground, trying to represent a bank that's near the reflecting pool. So some brown and some dark. I'm not sure what I used here. It might be neutral tint, or it might be Payne's grey. What makes a nice mix is the quinacridone rust, the brownie colour, and indigo, which is pretty dark but has a slightly bluish cast. So mixing warm, which is the reddish tones, the brownish, with blue, cooler tones, gives a nice effect, especially if you don't just mix it separately and then put it on the paper. But if you allow it to mix on the paper, run into each other, then you get a more varied or variegated, I guess, effect, which is a little bit more natural. So one thing to consider is trying not to be putting huge planes of uniform color for landscape, but mixing various tones of color, and also warm with cold, warm with cool. It's good to try and get some contrasts in your watercolors. So when you're thinking about what do I do, think about contrasting a darker tone against a lighter tone, like I just did there. That's bringing that particular tree there into the foreground now, or it's bringing it forward, relatively speaking. And so dark against light is a good contrast, of course, and also warm against cold. That's a tree that has some purplish tones in it, and I think I'm adding indigo there, a cooler tone anyway to it. Oh, I'm playing there with a little bit of turquoise, so it's definitely cooler to the violet. It's good to play, I think, anyway. I don't think you ever stop learning, and if you're playing with different combinations, just trying it, well, what's the worst that can happen? You can always throw it away, or somebody will like it anyways. Don't throw it away. I've made that mistake, thinking, oh, this is no good, it failed. But somebody somewhere likes it. It strikes maybe they focus more on some of the other elements that you were hung up on thinking they were bad. So you never know. You never know. So I'm continuing to bring things forward now. We've pretty much going to leave the background, the far background alone. Now we're into the midground and bringing things forward against the background, which means they should be darker than the far background. The only thing to consider here is in this particular photo that we're basing this on, it has a wonderful misty quality to it. And so we'll try and keep that in mind, see if we can get some misty feel somehow. Now there I'm just sprinkling on some pure water, some drops. Again, that's an effort to try and get a non-uniform effect, random effects, as much as possible. Dropping water onto the paint if it's the right level of dryness, not too wet, but not absolutely bone dry. If it's sort of in between, it'll form little clear rings where the water droplets fall. So you can get some nice sort of textured effects, as well as a somewhat of a unifying effect as the pure water runs through what you've painted. But you can overdo it for sure, and it probably takes a little practice to figure out when to hold off and how much and so on and so forth, as do all these techniques. Really, it's you're getting muscle memory in your brush strokes as you do them from painting to painting, so it's good to try and do, I would say, one painting a day. It's what I do. I'm definitely scared of losing my skills if I don't do it once a day, so that keeps me going. Now I'm trying to add texture. This is flicking the brush that has a little bit of, I first of all laid down a light color. This is going to be foliage. I laid down a light color, and now I'm adding splatters of darker bluey, greeny on top of that. So it's all in an attempt to get the illusion of something. Trying to put a bank behind that foliage there in that step. Now we have some rocks, which I'm attempting to do, but this didn't quite work out with the background tones. That's a little heavy color there. So you'll see me playing with that from throughout the picture, and my final version of the picture, which isn't shown, I just went back in and added some white gouache over these rocks to lighten them up. So sometimes when you mistake the tone, especially if you make it too dark, they kind of stand out like a sore thumb. And it's not necessarily what you want, unless you want that, of course. Then that's a good thing. Working now on the reflecting pond, just adding a very light wash, and then I think I'm going to go in and do a reflection here. It would be a reflection of the trunk of the tree. The reflections are somewhat lighter tone than the tree itself, and it's broken by maybe some light wave action, wind on the water. On banks of rivers and ponds and so on, there's usually a dark edge at the interface between the water. It's because of shadowing, usually. Dark soil that's there. Now I'm using a palette knife to try and increase this idea of waves breaking up the reflection. Once I get my hands on this palette knife, it's usually an obsession. So I'm going to look for everything that I can do. Scrape. I think this technique is called scraping. Sounds good anyway. So now I'm scraping away because I'm conscious that these rocks stand out a bit too much, and I'm hoping I can scrape them. But to be honest, I don't think that worked that well. It might be the moisture level on the paper was wrong. I've still got that tool in my hand, which is deadly. Finally, I put it down. Yeah, put it where you can't see it. Now I'm thinking, what do I do next? Well, I can move more into the foreground. because we're in the foreground, we're going to be darker still, and which of course brings things forward against the lighter areas behind them. I'm playing. Today when I looked at the picture, I had a strong feeling of turquoise tones, although that wasn't obvious in the foliage. It wasn't blatantly turquoise, but it gave me that feeling when I looked at the picture. So I don't usually use turquoise for the foliage in landscapes, but in this case, on this picture, it kind of made an impression on me, so I'm throwing it in now. This foreground has a ways to go, so it's going to be built up of a few layers. Now this is a fan brush, which is useful for, it's very stiff and fanned out, of course, and it's very useful for making images or impressions of foliage, grasses I mean, especially. You can kind of flick it up and it'll give that impression of blades of foliage, or you can use it in a dabby way to get some effects. You can experiment with that. Could be fun. But this is just kind of a straight up or a slight dab onto the page there with the color. When you're doing foliage, you need usually at least two colors because you want some contrast. If you just used one color for foliage, it would just look like a single block of color with no definition of anything in there. So using a light color first for the foliage and then a darker color coming in after would be a good thing. If your paper is moist, I'm tending to do wet on wet pretty much all the time. When it's moist, you get soft edges between everything. That's not necessarily a good thing. You might want some hard edges. To get hard edges, distinct hard edges, you need to have the paper dry first, and then when you put a layer of color on top of that, you retain a nice straight edge. When the paper's somewhat moist, like it was here, even though we went in with the fan brush, it starts out giving a distinct effect, but because it's moist, it's just kind of blended in. So again, a big variable is the dampness of the paper. Here I'm just taking out some color, removing some color with a piece of tissue, and that's just because I'm keeping in mind this idea of a mystery, a mysterious area, and I'm playing with that to see if I can kind of enhance that, especially towards the background and even the midground there, giving some mystery to the area. Also, it'll give me nice contrast when I put dark foreground on top of that. So now I think I'm waiting. Yes, we have to wait for this to dry because I want to come in with some hard edges. So I'm using an old defunct hairdryer. There's a few things wrong with it, but it works for this purpose. I cut that a little bit short. Now we're showing some hard edges we're going to get here. This is wet on dry, and I'm using a medium-sized sort of mop brush for this, and I'm just pressing down and keeping the bristles sort of flat to the page as I draw it up to give me the feeling of a tree trunk. So this tree will have a couple of colors in it. And remember I was saying that a good mix is a warm color, which is this brown, and then a cooler color, and I think this is the indigo. I can't tell, some of these colors might be Payne's Gray. But anyway, definitely a mix of a warm and a cool, or a cool to neutral. And I'm just playing with the way the paint moves there together to get a feel or a feeling for as realistic a idea of the tree as possible. As I'm doing this bottom of the tree, I'm still thinking, I'm thinking all the way through this, and I'm remembering now this picture is backlit, the sun is right at the back of the picture. I'm working on the foreground, so this tree is going to cast somewhat of a shadow, but maybe I'll get to that after I've completed the tree. There's a second half to the tree that's more towards the back, so it's like a second tree, or I'm not sure if it's part of the same tree from the photo. Anyway, there is a separation to these two parts, and I'm giving this second tree a little different color scheme to distinguish it from the first tree. I'm thinking in my mind I'm wanting these to look different, so I've made it lighter and somewhat different colors. Now what am I doing? Let's see. I'm flicking water on the tree. Yeah, again, trying to get texture. This is one way. I could use the palette knife too, thinking about it. The palette knife on trees like this can add furrows of light to it, which gives a good representation of bark. But in this case, we're looking at the back side of the tree, and it would be in shadow, so I think I intuitively made a better decision. Just splash a bit of water on it. You could try something else too, like indigo or some darker spots. You can play with that. Now what am I doing? I'm waiting for this to dry, maybe? Yes. So it's drying, and I'm hastening the drying with the hairdryer. One thing that you should note is that watercolors dry about one tone lighter than they go on. So you see these trees are lighter than the color I put on initially. And that means I'm also thinking now I'm going to go back into these trees once I've stopped fiddling with trying to do some foliage here. I'll keep looking and trying to find the balance here. So I'm using the fan brush again. This is a relatively dark mix of a green. It's either sap green, or I don't really like sap green on its own. It's much better mixed with something, with yellow or blue, and give you a different color. It's not really intended to be plastered on its own. So now I'm still considering, I think, I'm probably going to darken these trees. That's what's going to happen next. I'm still thinking of the tone of the whole foreground. So I'm adding some brownish tones there to the foreground, trying to unify it somewhat. And of course, when I do that, then I notice that the trees now are too close to that tone to really stand out. And so I'm going to be committed now to darkening these trees at the front. Playing with a little bit of water or something there. Or maybe it was paint of one kind or another. And spattering it on. When you're spattering, you really should, I'm bad here, I'm not giving you good advise just spattering it willy-nilly. You can use newspaper or something to cover up the areas you don't want to splatter. You can even use your spare hand to cover up places you don't want to spatter. It's very difficult to control spatter, so I would be warned on that. Any place you don't want the spatter stuff to go, then cover it up with paper. I'm still playing with this grass. It looks a little bit too symmetric, this curve at the front here, at the base of the tree. Like I was saying, anything that's too symmetric, or anything that's symmetric, is going to look a little unnatural. So here I'm coming in with the palette knife to mix that up a little bit. Just upward strokes there, scraping away. But in the back of my mind, this tree has got to get darker, as is the other tree. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm coming back in. For darks, we've got, like I was saying, indigo. We've got Payne's grey, which is a good medium usually, and we got neutral tint. And this was probably Payne's grey, I think. I don't know. I have them all next to each other on the palette. I don't really pay too much attention to what the colour is. I go to them instinctively, put them down, and hope for the best. And yeah, you know, let's see what happens is my motto. Now, in this particular technique for this particular painting, that's what's true. And for some other paintings, I'll be a lot more judicious and careful. But this particular technique, which is somewhat of a I was going to say improvisational. It's a bit loose. Then we'll see what happens, how it turns out. Using the spatter again. Again, I've got in mind that I want the very front of this painting, the very bottom, to be dark. This is the near foreground. And then as we go back through the midground, it's going to get lighter and lighter until we're quite light in the background. I love that water, don't I? It's like sprinkling holy water. There you go. I keep hoping for a nice effect. Well, this doesn't look bad. The problem with the spatter is it looks pretty good usually right after you've done it, but as you dry the painting, it can diffuse and not be so obvious. So I think I'm probably considering drying the painting here, or I might be considering going over to the left of the painting to put some grass in, since I've made a commitment with some foliage. Oh yeah, okay, I'm drying it. That left side of the painting needs some foliage in the foreground anyway. That's true. And I'm probably going to, well, let's see what I do. I've got a good memory, it's just really short. Aha. Drying this. It's a bit tedious, isn't it? I should have cut that back a bit for you. Cut stuff out. Ah, oh, okay. I want the tree darker. Let it be dark. Yeah, now the reason it has to be darker is that I'd already made that grass foliage at the front quite dark. So we're continually iterating on these tones. If that front is very dark, the tree certainly has got to be darker because it's going to cast a shadow behind the tree, which I'm just putting in there. And it's going to make more sense if it's darker. The other tree at the back behind that one, I think, can stay a little lighter. It gives it some feeling of space. It's behind the front tree anyway. Now I'm going back with the happy little fan brush to put in a few happy little blades of grass. There we go. And again, you think of two colors at least for foliage. Usually a lightish shade or tone and a darker shade, because there are spaces between the blades of grass. What am I doing there? Oh, I'm flicking. Oh, that was kind of a fruitless thing, I think. I was flicking probably darker paint, spattering paint on that. Well, mind you, there's a bit of effect there. Now I'm doing the second colour. It's probably a little too much second darker colour. There, you don't need to have equal amounts of lighter foliage, just enough black to give it some definition, or dark, I should say. And I intuited that the bank there now would have to be dark to make this grass piece, the foliage piece here, stand out. And again, we're always going back and forth with these tones. Continuing with the playing with the grass there. This is getting pretty close to the end. I could have stopped there. Actually, I could have stopped probably earlier than this. But why stop now? I'm having fun. Oh, God, I make that front really black now. Well, it's not bad, I think. It's certainly given good contrast anyway between the foreground and the background. I think that's a good thing to get it. Don't be afraid of going dark, going really dark, and going really light, because I think certainly my earlier paintings suffered from a sort of a monotonous quality to the tone. There wasn't really much variation between the light and the dark, so you tend to get one big flat-looking painting, and you're working with illusion here, so you're working on 2 dimensions, but you want the illusion of 3. So to get 3 dimensions, you've always got to consider things like shadows and things like variation. If you look at any object, any 3D object, whether it's an orange or an apple or a block of wood or something, you'll find there's variations in the tone, and especially when the object is lit, let's say from one side, so there's a shadow, and then there's the penumbra, sort of half shadow, and then there's the light part, and that's what tells your brain that, hey, this is a 3D solid object. So if you've just painted something one single tone, then you can't really have the sense that it's a solid object. So we're always going here and there trying to beef up these illusions. The rocks that I did just here underneath the brush, the brown and black things, they're a little too black. And I realized that after, And what I did was, when the painting was done, I came back in with some white gouache, which is an acrylic white actually, but it's very opaque. So it's pretty good for covering up a multitude of sins. Used in a small way. I've used it for clouds, highlights. I used it for highlights a lot. When you paint little figures, and the sun is, say, coming from the left of them, it's good to put some little white highlights on the head side of the head that's facing the sun. Put them on the shoulders too. Maybe have a look when you're outside in the sun, what's getting white highlights, and that'll tell you. Things like car roofs are often quite brilliantly white, even though they are a colour, they're reflecting the light. So it's the reflection of the sun. Anyways, those rocks will get changed after I've finished the painting, because they bugged me. But like I say, sometimes you can fix a mistake, but only if it's a small thing like that. Biggest mistake you make is trying to fix something like the sky or a large expanse of water, something like that. Anytime you go in without a good plan and just trying to eradicate something, trying to rub it out or something like that, you might as well just, throw it away at that point, because it ain't going to work. So, yep. And again, when you're splattering there, use some paper to cover up the area. Like I should have covered up the background. I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, I'm drying. I'm considering this done probably. I'm using a little bit of tissue to dry different areas to add some interest, some variation. Still thinking about the mystery in this photo, in the photo, and have I captured it? I'm not sure really if I have or not. Maybe it could have used a little more lifting of color on the foreground, even make the whole thing misty. But I seem to be happy there. I'm signing my painting with a dark color. It's not quite the color or the place I should probably be signing. We don't want to detract with the signature, but then again it should be legible. So I probably should have added a little bit of white to that and maybe signed with a grey or a grey-blue over that black dark area. So this is it. I think I've signed it anyway. And like I say, I'll be touching it up just on the rock things because they are bugging me. I'll touch them up with the white gouache. And other than that, I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and all the best.